Shalom and welcome. This is Jerusalem Studio, and less than 2 weeks after Bashar al-Assad fled Damascus for Moscow and the Israel Defense Forces destroyed the bulk of the Syrian air, naval, missile, and research and development power, future prospects for Syria, both internally and externally, remain vague. Who will eventually control it? Will Syria become a sovereign nation, in fact, and not only in title, as it was when Assad's rule rested on Russian and Iranian support? Will Turkey call the shots? Can peaceful pronouncements vis-a-vis Israel coexist with Jihadi ideology? To explore all of these issues and more, we are joined from northern Israel by Colonel in Reserve, Dr. Anan Wahabi, who is a senior fellow at the Institute for Counterterrorism at Reichman University, as well as a lecturer at Haifa University. It's good to see you, Colonel.
Good to see you. Good evening.
Good evening indeed. Also joining us from the Pacific in the United States is no other than Professor Russell Berman, formerly a senior advisor at the State Department's policy planning staff, currently the director of the Middle East and Islamic World Working Group at the Hoover Institution at Stanford University. It's good to see you, Russell.
Good to see you, Jonathan. Thanks for having me.
It's a pleasure indeed. And with me in the studio, of course, our TV7 editor-at-large, Mr. Amir Oren. Amir, set the stage for us.
So for many months, we all anticipated being in December and most of January in the transition period. But what we believed would be the transition was only from President Biden towards his successor, who turned out to be President-elect Donald Trump. What we couldn't and didn't anticipate was that in the Middle East, we will be in another transition from Bashar Assad, who is now in exile in Moscow, perhaps plotting his comeback. Maybe it's an illusion, but usually dictators do not retire. They always believe that sometime, somehow they will be back. And from Assad towards the next ruler of Damascus, who right now seems the best prospects seem to be for Ahmed al-Shara, who is also known as al-Julani. There is still enough time. There is an interim government. There are, of course, assassinations going on. Who knows if he will survive? Plots by his competition. But right now, Israel is bracing for the next Syrian government. It is not sitting idly by. It is conducting strikes against whatever hostile force can threaten it. And for the time being, probably throughout the harsh time of winter, is going to remain in a strip alongside the Golan Heights boundary. And by the way, later this week, the Security Council scheduled a meeting on the future of UNDOF, of the United Nations disengagement of forces and observers force, which may have been made moot by the events, but who knows if anything will supplant it.
Indeed. Well, we will touch momentarily also about the Security Council meeting, since al-Julani, the last time when he was in that front, leading Jabhat al-Nusra, he happened to attack those forces multiple times, including the Philippine force that was there in one of the posts where there were roughly 500 troops of UNDOF, and they were defending their positions and fighting back. There was another post with roughly 44 Fijian troops who were taken captive and were in captivity for 3 weeks. The day after they returned out of captivity, I actually had the opportunity of sitting with them and talking with them here at the UN headquarters in Jerusalem. But nonetheless, history, despite the fact that it's just a decade ago seems to be quite vivid at times for some, and for others it's not. But let's turn now to actually Stanford, to the Pacific. Professor Berman, I'd like to start with you this time around. When we're talking about Syria, on the one hand, we remember 1919 when the Ottoman Empire fell in the Levant, particularly when the troops, particularly of the Arab Legion at the time, some may remember, of course, Lawrence of Arabia being part of the secondary advance in that context, but they were waving thousands of those Palestinian flags, which at the time were the sign of resistance against the Ottomans, and conquered Damascus and set a new paradigm for that reality. Of course, later the French came, and there was the Druze uprising under Sultan Bashar al-Atrash and the various developments that ensued from there, making various shifts in the context of Syria. But nonetheless, looking at it now, what are we to take out of all of the various dynamic fluctuations and the fluidity still at play when we're talking about Damascus in particular and Syria at large?
That's a tough set of questions, Jonathan. It's been standard fare for the left for years to criticize the borders of the Sykes-Picot arrangement as artificial imperialist imposed borders on a region that was otherwise constituted. In some sense, we're still, as you point out, dealing with the failed unraveling of the Ottoman Empire and what will take place in that large geographical space. Damascus faces internal and external challenges. There are the neighboring powers, Turkey and Iran in particular, who are going to compete for the region. Right now, it seems that Turkey has the upper hand, and it seems indeed that Turkey may be mounting an offensive very soon. There are the the larger region, the Arab states who will be unhappy either with Iranian or Turkish domination, although it's unclear what they really can do, similar to what they were unable to do in Lebanon. And then there's the larger geopolitical competition between Russia and China on the one hand, Russia in particular, and the United States, and the United States and the EU, the United States in particular in the region. Um, all of these players have different interests, and unfortunately, they're going to be fought out over the body of the Syrian people.
Dr. Webe, the Syrian people, it's not one people, naturally. You have the Druze, the Alawites, the Christians, the Sunnah, the Shia, so on and so forth. You have 700,000 new citizens of Syria that were integrated by the Assad regime, those that arrived from Afghanistan and Pakistan, and Shiite communities from Iraq and Iran proper. Excuse me. But at the same time, you have also millions of Syrians outside the bounds of the state of Syria, from Europe to the United States to Australia to Turkey, for that matter. What are we to make from all of those complex demographic shifts that are inevitably expected to occur?
Yeah, the collapse of the Syrian regime of Assad after 54 years of governability of this family begins actually a new stage in the history of Syria. And maybe the title, what we study, the lesson studied from this history of Syria, is that it's not a real nation state. I mean, the nation that happened to be inside Syria and also inside as well as Iraq before that was not a successful arrangement. So we can see that the different communities will never be living together in the same way. They will not choose once again to live under a dictator. And you could see that after the collapse of Saddam Hussein and then the Arab Spring, little by little, the war started 14 years ago in Syria. the state began to be weaker and weaker, and the more it was decentralized, it was some like of a hybrid state, Syria itself, the more we could see the interference of the other forces on the ground. The Russian came in to help Assad the regime and to help the state of Syria, but immediately after, and we are witnessing today, a Cold War between two regional Muslim non-Arab states. The one is Persia, that also lost actually when this regime collapsed, and the other is Turkey. And I agree that Turkey has right now the upper hand in Turkey. It will be rejected by the Syrian communities, this interference. Of course, the backing of Ahmad al-Shara al-Julani by Turkey will be rejected by the Kurds, by the Druze, and by the Alawites. So it's not a stable arrangement. And on the other hand, deeper than that, we can see that also the Arab states, led by Egypt and Saudi Arabia, will also reject the return of the Ottoman Sultan. So yes, it's complicated. It's a very complex system, and hopefully that this stability will remain in Syria. But I'm afraid it will return to a conflictual reality.
This is something that I hear a lot, Mr. Oren. It seems like all the odds stand against the capacity of the Syrians to really establish a state with too many foreign interests involved in this story. It seems like an al-Qaeda affiliate trying to consolidate power and giving the rations left to some of those who had an even larger contribution in fighting for free Syria is something that the West might come to terms with, but the Syrians themselves will not.
So, the Syrian army obviously took part in the 1948 war, and there were outstanding issues following the armistice talks and agreement, demilitarized, UN monitored, and so on and so forth. But among all the major Arab countries, Syria was historically the weakest. Egypt was, of course, stronger. Iraq was stronger. And the Soviet Union exploited this fact in order to leapfrog over Turkey, a NATO member, and get a foothold in Syria. But this was an aberration. Between 1965 and 1990, 25 years, and the Ba'ath regime and mostly the Assad family made it look as if Syria, backed by the Soviet Union, is strong. But it was not. It was weak from inside. Obviously, earlier it lost Alexandretta to Turkey. Later, it lost the Golan Heights to Israel. And now, as this panel points out, we don't know what the geographical entity Syria would mean. Will it be a loose confederation of cantons? What is it going to be? Will it have a national army? Could it threaten its neighbors? What will be its hold over Lebanon? Of course, the Syrians don't recognize Lebanon as an independent state, even though they were forced to send an ambassador there. What will happen to Sheba farms, for instance, a point of contention between Lebanon and Syria, as well as between the two of them and Israel? So many questions.
A lot of questions, indeed. Professor Berman, when we're talking about strategic power competition, naturally, the Assad regime has signed the Belt and Road Initiative as well as the Port and Sea Initiative with China. On the one hand, it has been a staunch supporter or ally of Moscow in the entire history of at least the Assad regime, going from the father to the son. But right now, there are reports of Russia slowly, despite efforts to to maintain its air base Hammeimim in Latakia and the naval base in Tartus, it is shipping a lot of the munitions and the various systems that it has there to Libya at this point in time, which raises questions, of course, about the future of Russia in that country. But that brings me to America. We heard President Donald Trump come out and say that he's not in favor of having American troops there. In other words, give or take, but we know that there is an intention to withdraw from Syria. And to what degree is that going to expedite a certain rivalry between regional powers as well as local actors in a potential bloody war very similar to the one that we saw erupt in 2011?
A few points. Syria has signed on to Belt and Road, but it's not clear to me how significant the realization of that connection to China has been. The real big story in terms of geostrategic calculation right now is what appears to be the expulsion of the Russians from Syria. There have been mixed reports. I've heard the reports that you recapitulated of the Russians moving out. There are other reports saying they're trying to find some kind of agreement. I would hope that the U.S. and the West is working hard to get the Russians out of Syria. That has been an important focal point for the Russian projection of power into the Mediterranean and into Africa. That's a big deal. In terms of the prospect of what the United States will do, we're still in the Biden transition period, and it is a question will be how the United States responds to a Turkish incursion into Syria at this point. That's going to be a question for the Biden administration before it becomes a Trump administration question. President-elect, re-elect Trump was known to be very critical of the U.S. presence in Syria, and he's reiterated that position. On the other hand, he has expressed reluctance to endorse Turkish claims against the Kurds. We'll have to see how he responds to what is surely to be a new situation now with Assad gone and perhaps with a Turkish invasion by the time January 20th rolls around.
Indeed. We should also keep in mind that the elect National Security Advisor, currently Congressman Mike Waltz, the designate Secretary of State Marco Rubio, the Director of National Intelligence Ballard, all of them are proponents, Kurdish proponents. Of course, they have all of them also attached to Central Command, which has always been in favor of the Kurdish-American relationship. How is that going to translate into reality on the field is a good question, and we'll have to wait and see how those developments will also challenge the relationship between Ankara and Washington, which is still strained on different levels. It was during the Trump administration, the first one, where Turkey procured the S-400 and lost its share in the program of the F-35. But Dr. Wahabi, I'd like to ask you, I receive a lot of emails from different people around the world about the Druze question. What is the significance of Asweda, Jabal al-Druz, or Jabal al-Arab, depends on who you ask, and how is the relationship next to that in the southern part of Syria between Der'a and Jordan, which do have historic relations of relatives and various ties between the two sides and various tribes on both sides of the border. But at the same time, Muhammad or Abu Muhammad al-Jilani, he also comes from that area, and therefore there are some issues of loyalty. Who is loyal to who?
Yeah, great question. Now, with the collapse of the state of Syria, we could see immediately that we have two scenarios. The one is the return to a regional space where there is no real modern states here, real borders among the states, but a region, a big space. And inside that, there are a lot of communities that they live over the region, ethnic groups, more religious groups. And on the other hand, we could see that the other scenario is the division, that those states, as I mentioned, can never be living with the communities and integrating for a real modern entity. So today we can see that also the Druze that had a very central national role in the history. Today, they are living there in the south. They felt that they don't have the rights in the Syrian state. They do not believe that the Al-Julani, that is Al-Qaeda affiliated in the past, and he is still, we could see part of his latest announcement, he is still there with the radical ideology. They do not count on him. They don't think that such an ideology can dominate Syria with all these communities inside. This diversity needs a multicultural and modern and open and liberal state. The history of the Syrian people is so liberal. There is the real diversity, and it cannot be led by a dictator on the one hand, and then immediately replaced by a jihadi, radical jihadi, that is trying to show up as a modern and liberal, the way he is dressed, the way he's talking right now. But we make no mistake, he immediately will return to the same ideology. So here, the Jews, as well as other minorities in the Middle East, and there are a lot, they are waiting for the new administration in Washington. They know that Washington will decide, they make decisions, and then they will have a maybe clear future, how to behave, how to act, who can bake those minorities again in the Middle East. Are the superpower and other European states are willing to interfere deeply here in the region or not? A lot of open questions, and I think that till the moment there is no real decision taking in this sense. They will wait to the new politics.
Indeed. Mr. Oren?
Well, there is another wild card, and that is Daesh, ISIS. The American presence, military presence in Syria has been based on Operation Inherent Resolve. And even now, as the Biden administration is phasing out, the Pentagon keeps saying that in order to keep the thousands of Daesh fighters who are in detention, some 10,000, and their families, from breaking out and regrouping and a resurgence of Daesh, there must be some small American presence and the alliance with the SDF. So that brings again the question of the Turks versus the Kurds. And the Kurds have been betrayed at least twice in 1975 with the Shah and Saddam Hussein having the Shat al-Arab agreement, and then the United States deserting them. And in 2020 or 2021, again, the Turks and the Americans left them for their own devices, even though they were crucial for the fight against Assad. So this is going to be a crisis in waiting. Whether it will wait for January 20th remains to be seen.
We're drawing near to the end of the program, so each of you have roughly 45 seconds to provide an analysis for how are you seeing things moving forward. Mr. Oren, if you can focus on the Security Council issue. But before that, Professor Berman, we'll start with you.
It's a confusing situation with internal and external variables, maybe two models that are useful for analysis. Will Syria be Yugoslavia? It was held together by a dictator, and when Tito left, it just broke up into separate smaller nations. That could happen in Syria as well. An alternative would be Syria will become Lebanon, a country with different groups living in separate regions and really facing long-term ungovernability.
Dr. Wahabi?
Yeah, the Kurds will fight for an autonomy and to widen their territory also in Syria. Syria, I imagine, will be a non-central state where all parts want to be in the local cantons. They will remain with the currency, with the flag, and with the foreign affairs, but domestically, each alone. But I'm afraid this will happen only after quite a long way of instability. I cannot imagine that just after the collapse of the Syrian regime, Iran will remain in different ways to interfere in Syria and in Lebanon, and this will bring the new Cold War of the two regional Islamic states, Turkey and the Persians.
Sure.
50 years ago, there was the separation of forces agreements there were two armies, the Syrian and the Israeli one. There is no Syrian army now, but Israel, as well as Turkey in the north, and perhaps Jordan in the south, they all need some security belts in order to protect their territories from various militias, groups, terror organizations. So this is probably what will be discussed in the Security Council.
Thank you very much. I'd like to thank Professor Berman, Dr. Wahabi, as well as Mr. Oren for all of your insights. And I'd like to thank all of you at home as well. Until our next edition from here in Jerusalem, wishing you an Erev Tov.
I'm Eran, former Deputy National Security Advisor here in Israel, a diplomat, a strategist by training. I'm very happy to be at TV7 and offer my interpretation along my esteemed colleagues. The strong point of TV7 is to be a reliable source of authoritative insight in an era of shallow news environment that is very difficult for viewers to trust.